morning, everyone, again. My name is Gonzalo Muñoz from the University of Ciudadanas, and today we're honored to have with us Professor John Antonakis. As you know, he's a professor of organizational behavior at Lausanne University, and he's currently the editor-in-chief of the Leadership Quarterly. And he's going to, he's very known and recognized for his work on leadership. Particularly, I really like his work on leadership charisma. And I know that some of you have seen his videos on indigeneity on YouTube, which are also very widely known. And so, well, today's presentations is going to be 1 hour, and then we'll be half an hour or maybe 20 minutes for follow-up questions. So you can ask those questions in English or Spanish. If you rather do it in Spanish, we can translate that for you. That's okay. And that's it. So we're honored to have you, John, here. Welcome, and thank you.
Saludos desde Suiza. How's that for my little Spanish? When I was there last, Hector tried to teach me some words, but you know, a lot of them I think I cannot utter in public, but what I can say is muchas gracias, Hector, por esta invitación. And of course to you, Gonzalo. And you know, my visit last time with Edgar Caucel was very beautiful. So I would much prefer to have been in Chile right now and having a ceviche for lunch. And then even though the Peruvian ceviche is better, I still thought the Chilean ceviche was fantastic. So anyway, if you can send me some ceviche, I'll be happy. Okay. So may I go ahead and share my screen, everyone? So I run the show now. Okay, so thank you again for this invitation. What I would like to do is to explain what I believe are the criteria that top journals that care about doing robust science have. Some top journals, as you will see, I don't believe have the standards that I will try to communicate today. But at the end of my presentation, I hope I will be able to convince you that it's not just Leadership Quarterly that's gone crazy, but that many, many other journals are also adopting standards that we have been setting. And as I like to say at the Leadership Quarterly, we practice what we publish. So let me see what I mean by that. Let me show you what I mean by that. So what I shall do today is just highlight a few problems that I've seen consistently over my career as a scholar of leadership studies, organizational studies, management. I publish also in psychology. And I'm not really wed to any discipline. I work with many different people from many different kinds of fields. But what I truly care about is having a particular attention to the robustness with which we can make claims about the data we have. So let me just highlight some widely shared truths that probably many students learn as received wisdom when they join an industrial psychology or organizational behavior or management class. Now, this will be a bit of a shocker, but LMX, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, and whatever other leadership styles are some of the most important predictors of leadership outcomes. I guess that's received wisdom that most people would probably agree is, yeah, pretty true. Emotional intelligence matters much for leadership success. IQ doesn't really matter that much. Female leaders called queen bees keep other women out of power. Now, it's not me saying this, it's what the state of research says. And yes, there is a theory called the queen bee theory that apparently suggests that women, when getting promoted to high positions of power, keep out junior women because the senior woman is the queen bee and she has all the power and she doesn't care really about other women, apparently. Organizational citizenship, organizational trust, commitment, or what have you predicts work performance. I mean, I bet you many people would strongly agree with that statement. There's tons of meta-analyses on these topics. Yet, for me, I don't buy this. I don't buy any of what is said up there because most of the research on which any of those claims are made has not been properly causally specified. So I'm not going to keep my tongue in my pocket, as we say in French. I'm going to speak some inconvenient truths. My only God and only ideology that I have is to science. And this is what I'm going to try to defend and explain to you from at least the standards I know, where the only thing I care about is proofs and nothing else. Everyone else has to present an experiment or data. First on queen bees. Now, when I first heard about this theory that women who have power just push out all other women, so in general, women prefer to work for men and men prefer to work for men because women become these super horrible leaders. Well, a lot of that research, almost all of that research that was done was not properly causally specified, or it was done using qualitative methods. Like, for example, if I were to ask you, do you know a woman who acts like a queen bee? Of course you'll say yes. I also know a woman, or quite a few women, who do that. But how many women don't do that? You know, how many men act like super bitches and how many men don't? So we need to sample from the whole spectrum of leaders, and then we can see how it is. Now, if we look for certain things by asking questions in certain ways, we can find anything with qualitative methods or specific kind of targeted methods where you create a demand effect for the subject to respond. Now, the only paper that I know that is properly causally specified on this topic has been published by a Brazilian group, Paulo Arvate. This paper actually won the Best Paper Award for 2018 at the Leadership Quarterly. These authors were economists, and they used a design that's been around from the 60s, but completely ignored in our field. It's called the regression discontinuity design. And what did they do in the study? They looked to see in close call mayoral elections. So if the mayoral election was very close call, the person who wins, it's almost like it's random. So they took elections that were very close call across all the municipalities of Brazil over 2 election cycles to see what happened when there was a close call election where a woman won and then consolidated the power versus a man who then consolidated the power, won a second term. And what they found went completely contrary to queen bee theory. And you know, this is akin to randomization. It says it's like we're taking men and women and randomly assigning them to municipalities. And what they found is when women were appointed to power in this quasi-random way, they promoted more women to higher echelons of power and also closed the pay gap between men and women. They also looked to see in private firms that were around that municipality, and they didn't find this increase, which obviously meant that the increase was due to the woman being in power in that particular place. Now, this kind of research, unfortunately, is an exception. And at the Leadership Quarterly, I think we're just doing exceptions, and you will see in a minute why I say that. And this is strongly explanatory, I believe, and I can also, if anyone wishes to question me on why I say this, an explanation as to why our impact factor has so quickly increased and has left behind many top and more established journals. But I'm going to come to that in a bit. So what's causing all this problem? Because if you know some of the work that I've published on endogeneity, I cannot accept any kind of paper that has endogeneity problems, especially severe ones, into the journal, number one. And number two, I don't believe any of the research that has been published that has this problem. Why? Because it cannot inform policy. It is not useful to tell managers, do more of X or do more of Z so you can increase your profits. We simply don't know. And a lot of the research that we have, unfortunately, cannot help policy. Most of the predictors and some of the examples that I gave you before, and in fact, in most OB research or management research, most of the modeled independent variables are not truly exogenous. What do I mean by exogenous? Exogenous means that it comes outside of the system of variables in the equation, and it cannot be possibly caused by any variables in the equation or by omitted variables that predict the variables in the equation. So exogenous means we've manipulated it or it varies exogenously in nature. Unfortunately, I don't see that. In survey after survey after survey that we've done, 90% of the time, it's unfortunate that we cannot make any policy conclusions. The predictors are simply put endogenous. Endogenous meaning that you model Y to be predicted by X, but X itself is not exogenous, it's endogenous. So you have two endogenous variables where you try to model some kind of causal structure. It's impossible to do it properly unless you are omniscient, unless you are a god and you know all the possible variables that may affect the system of equations. So an endogenous predictor may or may not cause the outcome. We don't know unless we do some fancy econometrics or some fancy statistics, or we run an experiment. And when endogenous predictors are used in a regression model or in a structural equation model, it's simply not possible to inform policy. So I'll give you a very tangible example in a bit. But why is this trend happening? We did a review of the Leadership Quarterly, which I think is quite representative of management OB applied psychology journals. This is before I became editor, so it was all papers published in the Leadership Quarterly until 2014. And notice this very, very, very disturbing trend. This is the number of articles that are field surveys or observational studies over time, a humongous amount relative to other kinds of studies, especially laboratory studies or well-done archival studies that can be useful for making causal claims. Now, why is this a problem? Observational research of the sort. I'm going to give you a tangible example in just a minute. Let's just work with leader-member exchange. You've all heard of leader-member exchange. Take any textbook, except my textbook, and you will see that it's discussed as an important leadership construct. Often people use it as an explanatory variable. In fact, in the majority of cases, people use LMX as an explanatory variable or as a moderator, which is also an independent variable, in a system of equations where we might predict anything from, you know, whether they like the leader or whether they're well performing or any dependent variable, I don't care. Now, think about it just very carefully. What does leader-member exchange suggest? It means that there's a good quality relationship between the leader and the follower. Now, what causes this? What causes good leader-member exchange? Let's just suppose that being intelligent causes it, being agreeable causes it, being conscientiousness causes it. So let's assume that there are some individual differences that make the manager act in a certain way, which makes the subordinate like the manager. On the other hand, the subordinate may be hardworking, may be smart, may be agreeable, which may increase leader-member exchange. So leader-member exchange doesn't vary randomly in companies. Secondly, it can't be directly manipulated. You cannot manipulate whether I trust or like someone. I can only manipulate things that cause trust and things that cause liking, but I can't manipulate liking. To manipulate liking, I would need to open your brain, go inside your brain and play around with some neurons that would instantly make you like somebody. That's just not possible. So the first thing I want to say here is, if in theory a variable can't be manipulated, it shouldn't be studied. It is pretty useless as an explanatory variable. I don't mean that we shouldn't study it as a dependent variable. We certainly can, but as an explanatory variable, it's not very helpful. So let me give you an example why. So LMX leader exchange, as I think you've understood, it's an endogenous variable. It's caused by something. Now, if these causes also cause subordinate performance, and if we don't include these causes in the regression model, then any regression relationship we find with LMX and Y is going to be severely biased. Okay, so we need to know all the variables that cause LMX that may also cause Y, and we need to include all those variables. Now, we're not gods, and it's very hard to do that, which is why we need to use other kinds of designs. But let me just show you tangibly where this problem happens. So we measure X, LMX, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, organizational commitment, whatever, I don't care. Any typical variable that's measured in our field, and we stick it in the model, and it's not exogenous. Now, if you go back to your experimental statistics 101, the whole reason why we manipulate a variable is to make sure that no other omitted cause might explain why, because when you randomize, all possible omitted causes are balanced across X, X being 0 or X being 1, being the experimental group or the control group. So if Y reacts to the experimental treatment, it must only be due to the random assignment and not other threats to internal validity. So when there's a possibility that variables are omitted that may cause X and Y, we have an endogeneity problem. And there's so many things that could cause it. I'm just giving you some examples. You cannot possibly control for all these causes. No matter how hard you try, it's just simply not possible. Other designs are needed. But here's some stuff that can get you into AMJ, can get you into JAP, certainly will not get past my desk. I will desk reject this, is to do the following. Measure X at time 1, then wait a bit of time, then measure X at time 2, measure Y at time 2, or measure a mediator at time 2, and then measure Y at time 3. It doesn't matter, but you split up the times, and then you regress Y on X. What's the problem with this design? Well, if X is not exogenous, then it doesn't matter if X is correlated with Y. This is called the ex post ergo propter hoc fallacy. After this, therefore because of this. Imagine you have a headache and I take some apple juice and rub it on your head and your headache goes away. Was it the apple juice that made your headache go away? Or was it simply a span of time that went by that made your headache go away? Okay, so simply because something appears before something else doesn't mean that this thing caused Y. So this is a really, really big problem. So suppose that the LMX and subordinate performance are caused by some omitted variables. I will call that Z1, and I've indicated 1 for being time 1. So imagine at time 1, X and Y are both caused by Z. So the researcher has a problem. So they say, you know what? I'm going to regress Y2 at time 2 on X at time 1. Now, if the true structure of the data in time 1 is like this, it's very reasonable to suppose that Z1 is going to correlate with itself over time. And if it does, and if Z2 predicts Y2, then beta 1 is going to be severely biased unless we include in there all these omitted causes. So the only time that beta 1 will give us a correct estimate is if J1, G1, or B2 are 0, which means that X is exogenous. If J1 is 0, it means X is exogenous, so we don't have a problem. Or that the omitted causes don't correlate over time, highly unlikely. Or, you know, if Z1 causes X1 at time 1, it's quite sure it's going to cause it at time 2. So splitting periods does absolutely nothing to deal with the endogeneity problem. Splitting it up in 3 periods won't help. Getting an objective measure of Y will not help. And these are such severe problems, yet use this design, send it to AMJ or JP or JOM, and I guarantee you, you'll have a good chance to get published in there. So you shouldn't really be listening to me. Well, you should, because I'm giving you hints about how to publish in those journals. But I'm telling you, in a few years, those journals are going to change their standards because many journals are starting to do what we've been doing for a while now. So let me come back to that. So LMX is not the only problem. I mentioned others like transformational leadership, authentic leadership, or any other measured construct. To better see these problems, there's some really great papers we've just accepted at the Leadership Quarterly, and I strongly urge you to look at them. These papers are going to go on to be highly cited, and they're going to completely shift the field in terms of what the field is doing. A recently accepted paper has been on leader-member exchange, and the subtitle says it all. Back to square one. We've been studying LMX for 30 years, and actually, your guess is as good as mine about how it actually helps organizational performance. We don't know. We don't know because all of that research has been done in very poorly designed conditions. Here's another one which has completely unraveled and shown all the problems about creativity and innovation and how it's studied in leadership domains. This article is extremely highly cited already, just published 2 years ago, and it's already highly cited in the Web of Science. I would urge you to look at it because they run through, they unravel and critique all these problems in a very transparent way. you know, these are kinds of articles that I think would have severe problems to get published in other journals. Or this is one of my favorites. We just accepted this. It's one of the most cynical and one of the most provocative and one of the most incredible articles I think ever published, to show if you really want to have a recipe to publish stuff in leadership or in OB in general, read this paper. It'll give you the recipe to get in and to be successful as a publisher, but not to actually make any difference to the real world by affecting policy. And I think it's, you know, as researchers, I think all of us want to be honest and want to do a good job. The problem is that, you know, the training that we have gotten, and some of us that we got 10, 20, 30 years ago was not exactly up to par. And you know, it's not that I think people go out of their way to do bad research. I think most people are well-meaning, and I think when they realize these problems, then they will start to do something about it, because at the end of the day, it's really not fair to the taxpayers who pay our salaries for us to produce research that can't really help policy. So I think, Gonzalo, you mentioned my video. I have, if you haven't seen it, I guess we could put the links up. It's called Endogeneity and Inconvenient Truth. I filmed this many years ago, I think 10 years ago. So I was a bit silly and young. I'm still silly, but a bit old. But anyway, you'll have fun looking at this chapter if anyone hasn't seen this little video. So it's currently done. I think editors and gatekeepers have done an immense disservice to the field. And this is where I, as editor of Leadership Quarterly, have broken ranks with my peers. I think 5 diseases threaten the usefulness of leadership research, and not just leadership research, it's psychology research, it's management research. I wrote this article for leadership in general, but it was targeted to all disciplines of social science. Let me just quickly define what I mean by a disease. It's a disorder having some symptoms and causing some debilitating outcomes. In this case, the body that's affected is not us, and this disease is not COVID. The body here is knowledge, and the diseases are actually the incentives and how the publishing game is structured, which has given completely the wrong incentives to researchers. Why do these diseases exist? Well, I am extremely against how some of our collective practices are done, the conditions under which they are done, and the incentives that journals give to researchers, what incentives sponsors of research give, or what universities give, especially fetishizing quantity over quality. So I'm a very strong proponent of doing slow science, doing correct science, and doing science that's going to make a difference. Let me quickly run through these 5 diseases so you can understand what I'm saying, because I know it is a bit provocative. What I've been talking about all this time is what I call arigorium, a deficiency of rigor in theoretical and empirical work. I'm going to come back and give you some examples of this, but this is probably one of the major root problems that we have in our field. Our theories are not really theories. They are circular reasonings and tautologies. And a lot of what is done, unless it's experimental, it's not done very well. And even when it's experimental, it can be highly problematic. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit as well. Significosis, as I think you can understand the name suggests, it's the incessant desire to focus on producing statistically significant results. Now think about this problem. If journals only publish statistically significant results, and imagine we have a distribution of an effect size around some value, and imagine that suddenly we truncate this distribution only at the point where you pass the magic threshold of P is less than 0.05. Now, I'm not here to argue against significance testing. I love significance testing. I think significance testing is fantastic. And I think significance testing, the way we do it traditionally, is better than using Bayesian approaches, which make even more assumptions and can even cause more ways to go wrong. So I'm not against hypothesis testing. I'm against publishing only significant results. Because if you do that, what result do you think a meta-analysis is going to give you when you only feed it mostly significant results? This is highly problematic. So, you know, almost every theory we have in our field, almost every theory, you do a meta-analysis and you're going to show wonderful effects. Everything is significant. It doesn't work like that in medicine, because in medicine, they publish also the null results. And that's why they don't allow some medicines to go into the public domain, because they don't work, or they might even have very bad secondary effects. Another problem that's related to this, and so many journals have this problem, is what I call neophilia. Excessive appreciation for novelty and snazzy results. Why should that be a criterion to publish? Why? A good research study that kills an existing theory is fantastic. A good research study that replicates something and comes up with a null result is also fantastic. Someone's microphone is on. If you could just turn it off. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. Gonzalo, can you check the microphones of everyone and switch them off, please? Otherwise, I can do it quickly.
It's Sergio. Sergio.
Yeah, Sergio, can you turn it off, please? Thank you. So a result doesn't have necessarily to be novel to be useful for the scientific record. Next problem, theoria. You've probably heard of gonorrhea. You've probably heard of diarrhea. Now you know theoria, which is a much worse disease than gonorrhea and diarrhea, I'm telling you. Some journals, the only raison d'etre is to produce theory, or that you must produce theory in your empirical work, otherwise the result isn't useful. You know, in medicine, if medicine were to work like this, we wouldn't have advanced at all. The most important discovery in anesthesiology is propofol. I just had an operation 4 weeks ago on my knee for a meniscus tear that I acquired during a squash game. And I've had a couple of operations in my life, but I'm so thankful for propofol, because after you've received it, you wake up and you're not very itchy and you don't feel like throwing up. It's very, very safe. It's very unusual that anyone dies when they get a correct dosage of propofol. Yet it was discovered by chance. They were looking for an anti-emetic and something that wouldn't make people itchy, like opiate-based anesthetics. And today, 30 years or 40 years after the discovery, they still don't know how propofol works. Now, does that mean we can't inform policy? Does that mean that millions of people's lives can't be saved by opening them up and changing their hearts or giving them a bypass or whatever? So here's my point. The absence of a theoretical explanation does not mean we can't estimate a causal effect. And this is a severe hampering problem that so many journals have. They would rather perhaps have a nice story and a nice theory than a properly causally identified results, which is, I think, extremely problematic. And all this brings us to the problem of disjunctivitis, collective proclivity to produce large quantities of redundant, trivial, and incoherent works. So there are a lot of symptoms of these diseases: p-hacking, questionable research practices, hacking, hypothesizing after the results are known, suppression of replication studies, suppression of null result studies, and basic research that doesn't offer any theoretical explanation is not well regarded. All this creates crises, lack of quality research, and a lot of distrust in research. And such research, as I've said before, cannot really inform practice. Our theoretical models oftentimes are tautological. Like, for example, so many theories written about endogenous variables predicting other endogenous variables, but not identifying what are the ultimate causes. Or when I started to study leadership, charisma, I mean, I was amazed. The definitions of charisma I had were like some mystical quality. How does that help me if I know you have a mystical quality and I don't? How can we study that scientifically? Or a gift of grace, or something special that's been God-given to some people and not to others, okay, which means it's beyond scientific study. Or you have stuff like, you know, charismatic leaders are inspirational. Very nice. Charismatic leaders are inspirational. It's like, again, inspiring is part of being charismatic. It's the explanandum re-describing the explanans. So this is a big problem in theorizing endogenously and estimating endogenously. And then we have endogenous variables predicting endogenous variables, and we have other problems. And, you know, I can't possibly cover all of them. Let me just focus on one small problem, mediation. It's still done wrong, even though many, many papers have pointed out the problems of using Preacher and Hayes, of using Barron and Kenny, of using Edwards and Lambert. If the assumptions of the estimator are not met, then you can bootstrap till the cows come home, as we say. In other words, the cows, you leave them up in the mountains in the morning, and then they come home in the evening. So you can bootstrap the whole day. You can make 50,000 bootstraps. You can make 150,000 bootstraps. If your estimator is not consistent, you will not get the right estimate. So let me give you an example. Imagine I set up this data. I have an omitted cause Q that predicts M and Y, and the true causal effect of M is 0.5. So the indirect effect is 2 times 0.5, which is 1. Now, if I don't know what Q is, and Q is omitted from the model, but if X is exogenous, imagine that you've manipulated X in an experiment. You manipulate it by placing managers to be trained charisma or to receive alternative training. And then M is we code their speeches for charismatic leadership tactics. And then Y is we see how performing the workers are. Now, it's possible that some managers that are in the treatment group or in the control group are higher on M, not just because of the treatment, but because they're smarter, because they are more open and more creative. So these things we've randomized and we've equated everyone on validity threats on X, but we haven't done this on M. So we cannot regress Y on M with OLS or with SEM. We need to use what's called an instrumental variable estimation procedure. When we do use instrumental variable estimation and we correlate these two disturbances, or if we use two-stage least squares, we get the correct estimate, about 0.53. In this case, it's a small sample problem, but if we do this repeatedly, it will converge to 1, or if we increase the sample size, it will converge to 1. If you do a full mediation model, you get completely wrong result. If you do a partial mediation model, you get completely wrong result. And that's what Preacher and Hayes does, a partial mediation model, and it bootstraps the coefficient minus 0.37. It's completely wrong. Now, the only time you can use Preacher and Hayes is if M is exogenous. But how can it be exogenous if it depends on X? If a variable depends on another variable, it cannot be exogenous by definition. Pick up any article in most top journals, except LQ, and you will find this. Now, Shaver already wrote about this 15 years ago. Completely ignored. His article maybe has 100 citations. Look at Barron and Kenny, hundreds of thousands. Look at Preacher and Hayes, hundreds of thousands. Smith wrote an editorial in JPSP about this. Completely ignored. Look at what's been happening afterwards. When people test mediation, they don't do it properly. Now, JPSP has improved by ensuring that sometimes people manipulate M, but still, whenever they measure a process model, it's usually done wrong. I also wrote a paper, which thank goodness has been a lot more influential than Shaver's paper, and people are starting to pay attention to this, but you know, lordy me, I'm actually writing now just one paper on this topic. So for those of you who know the causal claims paper, it's a very broad paper, and I've written many topics in there. So slowly now I'm writing single papers just to break up that paper because it was a bit complex and difficult to follow for some people. For example, HLM. In this paper on making causal claims, pardon me, we did explain how to estimate HLM models properly, completely ignored. So we thought, okay, let's just write a paper on HLM and show what the problem is. We took a random sample of 204 papers from top journals in management and applied psychology, and we found that only 50%, 1 out of 2, used the correct estimator when they had panel data. And what I mean by the correct estimator is not HLM, not random effects model, fixed effects model, or what we call correlated random effects model. Now, I don't have time to explain this, but trust me, soon this is going to hit the fan because McNeish has written a paper in Psychological Methods, word for word saying what I said 10 years earlier. Bleeser, who's the former editor of ORM, has just published a paper as well, saying exactly the same thing as we did. And we just now published this paper, again, repeating the message. So be warned, anyone who's going to use HLM or do longitudinal estimation, take the time to look at this paper or some of the papers we cite in there which say the same thing. And this has been known in econometrics for 30 years. But again, it has been ignored in our field. The problems go on and on and on. 90%. We found that leadership researchers failed to address up to 90% of design and estimation conditions that make causal claims invalid. This is not good. We found in the Leadership Quarterly, again, this is before I became editor, about 80% of articles had severe endogeneity threats. In a recent Journal of Management paper that I published with one of my doctoral students, Thomas Fisher, we found in testing process models, in other words, mediation models, that only 26% of articles used an exogenous predictor. Can you imagine? So 74% of the time, X was endogenous. That's terrible. And to make matters worse, only 2% of the articles, actually I think 1 or 2, used the proper estimator when estimating the process model. So really nothing has improved, especially in mediation, since I published my work, and since Shaver said that and others have said it. So I think I'm going to have to just write a paper on mediation to address this. We have many problems. Very quickly, just to give a couple in terms of studying power. So much research has been done to study power, where you study people who have power versus people who don't have power, and you find that these people who have power are more corrupt, or more selfish, or sexually harass. Now, is that caused by power? Or is it possible that people who are corrupt or who are serial harassers seek power? We don't know. Unless we can randomly assign people to receive power, we don't know what the effect of power is. Or unless we can understand what is it that drives people to seek power by finding instrumental variables that predict the first stage. How many studies have done this? 0. Very hard to know. So researchers turned to experimental research. And we wrote a paper in the Journal of Management, which, by the way, won the Journal of Management Impact Award for papers published 5 years ago. So we published this paper in 2015. And I just found out a couple of weeks ago from the editor of Journal of Management that we won the Impact Award for over the last 5 years, where we strongly criticized a very common way of manipulating power in the lab by using the typical, what I call Galinsky priming paradigm. So you randomize subjects to write a story about when they had power or what they did yesterday. So this is the power manipulation. Now think about this. You ask them to write a story about when they had power. So you're kind of giving them hints about what the study is about. And you ask them to write about what they did yesterday. So you have an asymmetrical demand effect. These people know what the study is about and may act in ways that is deemed acceptable or proper for what is being studied. So this is highly problematic. The manipulation check in this design, count how many power themes there are. That's not a manipulation check, that's a compliance check. Did they comply and write an essay about power? Did they comply and write about what they did yesterday? And it's going to be kind of random if you find anything on power here. So you see, hundreds of papers published on this, thousands of papers, thousands of citations. It took till 2015 before Raquel Sturm and I said, but wait a minute, is this a legitimate manipulation? They've done other kinds of manipulations. Think of a time you had power, or think of a time you were powerless. Now we don't have an asymmetrical demand effect. Now both subjects know about what the experiment is. So if we find a difference, the demand effects are balanced. No, there's another problem in here, what I call the poison medicine problem. Power or no power, being dispossessed of power. Now, if I find a difference, why is there a difference in Y? Is it because this increases and this decreases? Is it because this does nothing and this decreases? Is it because this drops, but this drops more? Is it because this increases and this also increases, but less? You don't know. You can't estimate the treatment effect. So this is what I call the poison medicine problem. And how many times have I come across this now since I thought about it? Oh, hundreds of cases. Amy Cuddy's, think power posing versus being like this, or comparing some kind of, abusive supervision versus kind supervision, or ethical leadership against unethical leadership. These are all poison medicine problems, and you cannot know anything when you contrast a poison versus a medicine. If medical doctors did this, people would think they're mad, but we do it all the time, and it's time. This stuff has to stop. Charisma, another problem. You study people who are charismatic to see if they predict company performance. Well, why they're charismatic? Could be for many reasons. Because they're smart, because they're open, because they're extroverted. I don't know. And it's also possible that companies that do well, if a CEO is doing well, then people will rate him or her more charismatic than if it's doing poorly, holding constant the same behavior. Highly problematic. Or experimental research, where you randomize managers to receive training or nothing, or you randomize them to receive training or bogus training, but you don't compare against maybe a strong counterfactual like using bonuses. Okay, so it's really very unfortunate about how this is done. So I've already talked about this. I'm going to skip. So it was just giving an example of the prompt that is given in priming studies, which is problematic. And then what's also very problematic is inconsequential tasks that are not costly, cheap talk. And this is typical what I find in vignette studies in our field. Hector walks into John's office and sees that John is a bit sad. Hector heard that John's dog died the day before. Hector has a big deadline because the board of directors needs him to make a presentation. So he walks in the office, he sees John has got tears in his eyes, but he ignores John, puts a file on the table and says, John, quickly run these numbers. I need this by 3 o'clock. And he walks out. And then we're supposed to rate Hector on what a good manager he is. Yeah, most people will say, oh, Hector is a real not nice guy. He doesn't care about his employees, whatever. But wait a minute. In the real world, if Hector was really under such a deadline, and John knows that, and John has a job to do you think John would really not do the job properly? Or do you think John would really retaliate against Hector? If you think that's the case, then create an experiment that allows for costly decisions, costly retaliations, where it's not just cheap talk, but subjects are put in a game theoretic design, wherein when they choose to do something, it's costly to do it. That if they do retaliate against Hector, and if Hector finds out because randomly we give Hector 1 out of 3 times information about whether John retaliated or whether he stole money or whether he didn't do the job properly, then Hector is going to fire John's ass. And that's what happens in the real world. But when we do all this in vignettes, you can write whatever you want. Hector's not a good leader. He's abusive. But Hector, you are not. And you're a very nice guy, by the way. So does power corrupt? We don't know. We really don't know. So the only way we can study it properly is to give people real power, give people real resources, and then see if they abuse their power and to take advantage of it and serve themselves versus the greater good. So we started doing some game theoretic designs to study power. Other researchers are also doing this, which is fantastic to see. But we really need to up our game. Okay. You can see the study by Bendahan and company in the Leadership Quarterly, which I think is a great study. And it's not because I'm co-author. If you're interested to see how we do charisma, and Gonzalo mentioned that there's a few studies where we've really been very, very critical about how charisma was studied. I had some problems publishing this paper. It was rejected at Academy of Management Journal. It was rejected at Journal of Applied Psychology. And by chance, I made a presentation and Sim Sitkin was in the audience, and he was editing a special issue of Academy of Management Learning and Education on leadership development. And he said, hey, why don't you send it to the special issue? And that's how it got in. And it legitimized my way of seeing charisma. And then afterwards, everything followed. HB asked us to write a paper on this. We wrote an annual reviews paper. We managed to get a paper in AMJ. And I'm doing a lot of research right now on charisma. If you're interested, you can go to my webpage. If you click on that link, you can see all the charisma experiments we're doing. We have a paper under review now in management science where we have a big field experiment and several lab experiments to study the causal impact of charisma on worker performance, but also on solving coordination problems. We just accepted a paper in the Leadership Quarterly as well, which does a fantastic laboratory experiment on charisma. They take students, they randomize them to see a charismatic condition or a control condition. Within each condition, they're randomized to receive a flat wage or economic incentives. And they show that charisma can induce people to work as hard as they would when they're receiving high-powered economic bonuses. So it's a really, really cool paper, just got accepted in LQ. Very quick run on intelligence, and then I'm going to wrap up in about 10 minutes. So we have the impression from meta-analyses that the correlation between intelligence and leader performance is pretty low, about 0.15, 0.2 when intelligence is measured objectively. And I've been very critical of this research for several reasons. Number one, the functional form has always been assumed to be linear. And Dean Keith Simonton wrote what I think is a brilliant theory in 1985 in Psychological Review, where he showed that any correlation between intelligence and an outcome, whether it's objective or subjective, will never be linear, but will always be curvilinear, either always positive and monotonic, or it actually may be inverse J-shaped. So why did he say that? What he showed was theoretically, analytically with mathematics, that as intelligence increases, normally the leader will get better, but after a certain point, you have what's called a law of diminishing marginal utility. So, you know, having an IQ of 130 versus 140 is not going to make any difference. For objective outcomes, the effect should always be positive monotonic. For subjective outcomes, he said, it'll actually be inverse U-shape. Now, that's a completely crazy theory, completely ignored. Not only that, oftentimes measurement error is not controlled for. Oftentimes, other individual differences are not controlled for. And oftentimes in multi-country study or multi-organizational studies or studies over time or with multiple leaders, things like fixed effects are omitted. So fixed effects is this problem identified in the HLM literature. So this is some data I had on objectively measured intelligence and some outcome of leadership, in this case, idealized influence. Now, when you fit a straight line through it, you get a correlation of 0.15, which is close to what Judge and company have published in Journal of Applied Psychology for the effect of general intelligence on leadership outcomes, whether objective or different source outcomes. In reality, if you model this data correctly, control for personality, control for age, control for leader sex, control for leader fixed effects, control for leader personality, control for organizational effects, control for country effects, control for time effects, actually, it's a curvilinear relation, almost precisely what Dean Keith Simonton suggested in 1984. So I partnered up with Dean Keith Simonton and Jonathan Y, who's an intelligence researcher, and we wrote a chapter on intelligence in the book called Leadership Thinking Skills, if you're interested in that. Or if you want, just email me and I'll email you my chapter. So here's what I wanted to show you, where a theory that was written in a very clever way, in a mathematical way, which is what we don't see today, completely ignored. But 30 years later, I had the data and I contacted Dean Keith Simonton. I said, you know what? I've just reinvented what you said 30 years earlier. So his idea was the following, that if the average IQ of the followers is at some level, assume 108 IQ points or 20, whatever, 2 Wonder League points, the optimal level of IQ should be about 1.2 standard deviations from the mean of the group. You can read his paper to see how he does it, but that 1.2 standard deviations theoretical comes from the fact that the leader must be smarter than the team he or she is leading, so that they can help them find solutions to problems. But at the same time, they need to be smarter to keep rivals at bay. But on the other hand, if they're too smart, no one will understand them. No one will identify with them. And they will seem aloof and distant. And this is why there is this curvilinear effect, which is what we discovered in objective data that I had gathered with Robert House, and then also published with Simonton. So you cannot characterize in a meta-analysis the effect of IQ on an outcome with one parameter, because the parameter changes. You need to take the first derivative at any point of the curve with respect to x. If I take the first derivative when Wonderlic is 20, the standardized effect is 0.63. So the instantaneous slope in changing IQ, it's a very strong slope, 0.63. That's very different from 0.15. As IQ increases, you see over here, it's very, very high, and then it gets lower, 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 lower. It's flat, in this case, at 1.2 standard deviations, just what Simonton had predicted mathematically in a theory written 30 years ago. And it starts to become significantly negative when the leader is too smart. Now, imagine we send our data like this. Everyone sends their data to JPMJ like this. Judge does a meta-analysis and finds linear relationship. Well, no kidding. If you haven't modeled the functional form correctly, you're not going to help. So we need to go back and redo everything, especially with respect to intelligence. Anyhow, there is some hope, especially I think when I became editor at LQ, that I changed how things should be done. I wrote a very controversial editorial. If you want to read it, you will see what I think in there. But I think also other journals are starting to do what we're doing. We publish replication and null results. We care about stronger theorizing, and we care about shutting down theories that don't work. We are strongly incentivize researchers to come and send us good lab and field experiments, and advanced designs like regression discontinuity, difference in difference, instrumental variable, Heckman selection model. So these are all econometric designs. If you don't know what they are, look at my paper on making causal claims where we explain them. And we have all kinds of research that we publish. We also have before we accept an article or before we conditionally accept it, we have another round of reviews with expert methodologists. We have 4 of them that are full-time associated with the journal, and they check everything. They re-engineer the results to make sure they're correct. They make sure the correct estimate is used, ensure that limitations are correctly identified. Other journals are starting to do it. So we're calling for more experiments, but experiments are not necessarily the only thing that are going to save us. In a paper that we just wrote, by the way, with Bernie Quiroga, who is a Chilean researcher in Chile, he's in management and operations. We did a comparison of experimental research across different fields, including economics, operations research, psychology, and management. And we found some very interesting things. Use better practices, your papers will get more cited. So we have a lot of validity threats. I'm not going to run through them, but let me just say that typical vignette studies, typical non-incentivized designs, and using deception like is often done doesn't help you to get good estimates. So we explain in this paper what we call the 10 commandments of experimental research. So if you are doing experimental research, I urge you to look at the paper by Lonati and Company. It's in the Journal of Operations Management. And you can see how we've tried to take the best of psychology and the best of economics and put it together so one can do really good experiments. So I'm not going to run through all this because I would like to have at least half an hour for questions and answers, but there are 10 massive problems that we identify, and we hope that we will be able to stimulate better research in experimental research as well. I think a lot of you know me more for my insights in econometrics and in non-experimental research, but now I'm starting to look more at what we're doing in experimental research, because at heart also I'm an experimentalist. Just to show that overall, on average, if you use the good techniques, you're going to get about 4 more citations in Web of Science than an article that doesn't. So I guess that's a good incentive to want to do good science. We also compare different practices. Economics is the baseline condition. So for example, you see that psychology, management, and OM, that's non-economical, have a much higher proportion of articles that don't use compensations or incentives. In management, we oftentimes do the manipulation check before measuring the dependent variable, which creates a huge demand effect. We have huge demand effects in psychology and in management. Anyway, this goes on and on and on. I think you might find it very, very interesting. And then the final thing, when I became editor, many people shook their heads and said, oh my God, are you guys crazy? You're going to put a Taliban like Antonakis to run the Leadership Quarterly? I promise you, there were people very worried about it. There were even people thinking they were going to sign a letter to stop me from becoming editor because no one would be able to publish in Leadership Quarterly. No one would send their work to Leadership Quarterly, and no one would cite Leadership Quarterly. Exactly the opposite happened. Our submissions are up. Our impact factor, when my team took over in 2007, is now close to 7. And you heard this from me. I've done estimations. Next year, it will be over 9. Mark my words, over 9. We've already overtaken Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, JAP 2 years in a row, Personnel Psychology, JOB. So many management journals are behind us. There's only a few now that are left, and we are very hot behind them, AMJ, AMR, ASQ. But you just watch what's going to happen next year. And this change, by the way, if you look at it from a difference in differences point of view, we can compare Leadership Quarterlies to other journals to see what happened to the other journals in 2007, 2008, 2009, and none of our competitors have this jump, and none of the general journals have this jump either, which means that it's not something that drove the impact factor of all journals. Perhaps leadership became a more sexy topic. It's not that. It's what my editorial team has done, and it's not just me. It's 20 editors and my 4 methods advisors and 180 board members who truly believe in this mission that we should do research that is consequential, that is robust, and that matters. If you look at site score, the same thing, and next year is going to shoot up some more. If you look at the top factor, which looks at open science practices, LQ is one of the top journals over there. The average of 412 journals in management psychology that they've rated has a score of 4.5, and our score is 9. So we're doing very, very well on that metric. And like I said, I don't think I went mad, and I don't think that Elsevier went crazy by choosing me. Other journals are doing exactly the same thing as our journal have done. Corporate Governance, Journal of Business Venturing, which is an A+ journal in strategy, SMJ, Journal of Operations Management, ETP, which is again an A journal in entrepreneurship, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of Management. The new editor now is going to care very much about these things. You see, there's some journals that you know that are not on there. Mark my words, one day they're going to do the same thing. They just can't continue doing business as usual. Anyway, I have taken up my 30 minutes exactly. I went a little bit fast through the problems in experimental research. I'm happy to go over them for 5 minutes if someone wishes to ask me that question. But I will stop talking now, and will be very happy to answer any questions from the floor. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, John, for an excellent and somewhat apocalyptic presentation, I guess. There's one question by Cibeles. I'm not sure if she's still here with us.
So it's on the chat.
Cibeles, yeah, Cibeles asked something on the chat. Maybe she wants to.
Okay, I will read it out. Yeah, so we have, is that Cibeles Mirales? So Dr. Antonakis, you can call me John, thank you. How refreshing and wonderful is listening to your ideas and critics. Well, thank you, Cibeles. I'm very happy to make your acquaintance. How far do you think we are to see other influential leaders in our field to recognize and act on the problem? Well, I think others are doing it. I think in the last slide, I showed you at least 4 or 5 very good journals in our field that are following to some extent closely what we are doing with respect to causality. They're not doing the same thing with respect to open science practices, publishing null results, replications, non-experiment, and research that is not necessarily adding to theory. But at least on the endogeneity problem, I think good journals are starting to pay attention. You know, the day JAP and AMJ starts to pay attention, I'll be very happy and I will feel vindicated. I'm sure that they will. So I don't know, I don't know. It depends so much on the editors and who they put as editors. Most of the times, these big organizations, they won't appoint someone who's going to rock the boat. They want, very gradual and incremental change. I was very lucky that I got the opportunity to do what I did at LQ, and in a way, did an experiment. So I hope I answered your question, Sibelis. Next question. An exception would be individual differences such as GMA, right? I suppose, Edgar, you are saying as an exception to modeling as an independent variable. And if that is your question, yes, I agree with you. Traits that are stable can be assumed for most intents and purposes to be exogenous, unless there's been selection on these traits. So in our JMP paper, we actually showed there was no selection on IQ because we showed a wonderfully normal distribution of IQ. So that company was not hiring managers on the basis of IQ. They were hiring them on the basis of other characteristics, which is strange because most of those firms were insurance companies, and you would hope that they pay their managers for their competence and what they know in terms of designing insurance programs and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess I would say that if there has not been selection on the traits, that traits can be considered exogenous. So for example, if I'm smart and I can help my workers do their job better, and their job satisfaction increases or their performance increases, it's for sure going from intelligence to performance, because when you have endogeneity, it means that omitted variables explain two things. Now that's going to be very difficult to find an omitted variable that explains both these things unless it's genes and some kind of genetic influence which determines IQ. But if it does, then we can lock in its effect on Y. This is called Mendelian randomization. And there's actually quite a lot of research that's been published today where you use genes as instrumental variables of certain phenotypes. So for example, if someone's saying transformational leadership causes performance versus someone saying intelligence causes performance, this is much more likely to be robust, because think about the first case. Transformational leadership causing performance, transformational leadership could be caused by intelligence, or it could be caused by performance. When your workers are more performing, it makes you treat them more transformationally and more considerate. But you see, if satisfaction goes up or if performance goes up, that doesn't change my IQ. My IQ is fixed. My sex is fixed. My age increases. Day by day, I get 1 day older. So these things are exogenous. So thank you, Edgar, for bringing that up. Gonzalo, you had a question.
No, there's Lionel had a question about pre-published reports for Leadership Quarterly, pre-registered reports in Leadership Quarterly.
I'm not catching that.
There's a question by Lionel.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can ask the question directly.
Okay.
So yeah, so as you were talking, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I think I learned a lot. As you were talking, I was thinking that after you collect your data, there's nothing you can do about, many mistakes that probably you're doing. So, and I recall that I think that Leadership Quarterly is doing pre-registered
Pre-registered reports, yes,
yeah.
Yes.
So, and I was thinking that maybe that's a solution. So before you collect data, just make sure that everything is correct. And
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit how that works? So,
Sure.
and I'm thinking in kind of leveraging the expertise of people at the editorial team to, improve my paper beforehand.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm going to take off my shirt, a bit hot. Today, I am Iron Man. This is the Iron Man jersey. Coincidentally, Lionel, I'm doing a webinar on the Leadership Quarterly and publishing in the Leadership Quarterly, I think next week. I need to just double check my diary. Hold on, let me just double check this because I think this could be interesting for some of you if you want to find out how to publish better in the Leadership Quarterly. What I say today may overlap with a little bit. Sorry. Just need to get on my computer. on my other computer, sorry, because I'm running two computers. So I just did one a couple of days ago, a webinar on the 29th of March, and I have another webinar on the 13th of October in the morning, Swiss time. So whoever's interested, you can take a look at it. It's also going to go on the Leadership Quarterly webpage, and you can download and see a half-an-hour presentation about LQ. But just to answer your question, Lionel, the safest way to publish in my journal or in some of the top science journals is to do a registered report. So what does that mean? You send in a paper where you identify a problem, you do a review of the literature, and then you write down the design, what you intend to do, what data you're going to gather, how you're going to gather it, how you're going to analyze it. That gets reviewed. So when that's submitted to the journal, I will look at the problem. And if this problem is trivial, if this design is extremely bad, if it's addressing a problem that's not interesting or important, I will desk reject it straight away. If it does have some interest in it, we will put it into review, and then the reviewers and the editor will give feedback to the authors to update the design. And the article then it's co-constructed with the editor and the reviewers. Now, of course, you lose a lot of control of the process, but at the same time, you gain the expertise of an editor that's going to work with you, and the reviewers who are also experts who are going to work with you and don't have a stake in the game, at least as the author does. And once you gather the data the way you said, and you analyze it the way you said, publication is almost guaranteed. Okay, now registered reports are much more useful for experimental studies. They can also be very useful for studies that want to study causal claims using different kinds of designs. You know, registered report's not going to work for an observational study or some kind of longitudinal study where you don't have exogenous variables. I mean, that I will instantly desk reject. But certainly for experimental research, quasi-experimental research, archival research, and it really saves time because you don't run the study, you don't gather the data, you don't waste all the time and money to do that. And, you know, we will give you a signal straight away as to whether we think this is interesting or not. And by the way, I'm not scared to desk reject papers. My desk reject ratio is about 70 to 80%. Most other journals are at 50%, 40%, and it's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. I know editors who tell me, you know, how the hell can you do this? You know, when you have some kind of big shot that sends a paper, you know, what other editors may do is they will assign the paper to reviewers they know will reject the paper or give very tough reviewers. And then they say, oh yeah, the reviewers don't like the paper because they don't have the guts and the courage to reject the paper. So I'm very honest in this regard. My editorial standards are very clear. If you meet them, I put the paper into review. If you don't, I will desk reject. So I won't waste your time, and you know exactly where you stand with me. Thank you, Lionel. I see a question by Eduardo Barros. Muchas gracias. Felicitaciones a los organizadores. Ah, okay. Thank you. That's for you guys.
Yes. There's another question by Maximiliano down almost at the bottom.
Ah, yes, Maximiliano. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Maximiliano. I was wondering if you're aware of any resources that can help us implement better and more robust design. Sadly, many of us haven't had the problem with ideological education. I'm thinking line of Sir John's paper. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's a great paper. So Gwendolyn Sir John's has a great didactic paper on experimentally randomized instrumental variables. So when you can't randomize to some construct like LMX or like trusting your supervisor, that you can't randomize that, but you can randomize the causes of that, and then you can estimate the model using instrumental variable estimation. Now, in my 2010 paper, I think we were perhaps the first who ever said this, is we said the perfect instruments you can have are ones you have randomized. But no one paid attention to that. Sir John's did, and she wrote a very nice article that she sent to the journal. This paper, I think she won't mind me saying it, it was rejected at JAP. I mean, I feel sorry for JAP because they would have had a great paper published under their name, but they rejected it for two reasons. They said, well, we already know this result. So what she showed was how some, perception of whether you like your boss or trust your boss affects outcomes. We know this from meta-analysis. And she's like, no, you don't, because all those meta-analyses are full of endogeneity. So anyway, tough luck for JAP. We got Sir John's work. I was so impressed with her work that I've also appointed her as a junior methods advisor for our journal. So she's an economist who switched over to doing experimental psychological research, and this paper is wonderful. So I will try to do more papers like that. I have cited some papers in my presentation, and Hector, Gonzalo, you feel free to distribute my presentation because those references are in there. But I'm going to push as much as possible methodological papers in the journal because it's in our editorial policy to also publish methods papers. Okay, so we have Hector. Oh, my boss, Hector. Hector, I hope you're going to say something about my dog, or it's just business again. It's business, eh? You see, I knew it. Now, my dog is fine and well. One of them is blind, but she's very happy blind dog. So, John, I have got a feeling, or I hope it's a nice feeling. The industry of publication is leading to bad research because the mantra publish or perish. So slide science seems not feasible. What can we do about it? Yes, you're right. I agree with you. At my faculty, we will tenure an assistant professor if they have 3 A papers. Now, by A, it doesn't have to be 3 AMJs. It can be a top field journal at the level of LQ or JOB, but that's good. So we take our time to read the papers and expect 3 A papers. To get tenure to full professor, you need to have 5 A's and lots of impact, lots of citations. So we've had many cases of assistant professors wanting to become assistant professors in OB, coming from the US internationally with 8, 10 JAPs, 3, 4 AMJs, 3, 4, and we didn't take them. Why? Because those were cheap AMJs and cheap JAPs. Cheap by meaning they were not done robustly. So at least in my faculty, we have a very strong influence from the economists, and economists are very prickly about these things. They much prefer quality over quantity. I'll give you an example. At Princeton, a guy called Chassin went from assistant professor to full professor of economics at Princeton, which has a lot of Nobel winners. I mean, these people know what they're talking about. He only had 5 papers. Full professor, he jumped from assistant to full with 5 very good papers. Sylvain Chassin, if you want looking up. So this is very typical in economics. In our field, unfortunately, and in psychology in particular, we like to count the beans. How many beans in the bag? What's better? An AMJ with 50 citations or a really well done JOB with 3,000 citations? Any day I'll take the JOB. So simply publishing an AMJ doesn't mean the paper's good. And simply because it's published in a lesser journal doesn't mean that it's not good. Because now in general, good papers go to good journals. But unfortunately, I think the reputations of some of our journals are not well earned. So we need to slow down. And why don't you become dean, Hector, and then you can impose this. Become a benevolent dictator.
No, but John, today, how to convince deans about that quantity is less important than quality because they are under pressure about rankings, about the reputation of the university.
Become an associate dean. I mean, if you look at my publication record, I didn't publish for 4 years. Why? I was associate dean. Why? So that I could help to join this effort to help change our school. It was very costly for me, extremely costly, because I would have had 20 or 30 more papers right now in those 4 or 5 years. That slowed me down very significantly. So, the only way we can make a difference is to get on committees, is to preach this, is to become associate deans, department chairs, and convince people. I mean, it requires leadership and guts and courage and time. It's a very difficult job. But school by school, we can change them if we are committed to doing this. On the other hand, journals are going to start doing this, like LQ. I'm not publishing 80 papers a year like it used to be. I'm publishing 50, 60 very good papers per year. So I've slowed things down. And getting into LQ now is going to be a really costly signal showing that, hey, this is tough to get in there. Look at the impact factor of this journal. So I think that's at least my end as an editor. I think I'm doing that. And I think other editors are starting to do that. And I think it will help slow down things a little bit to do slow science just like cooking slow food. You know, if you want McDonald's, then you know where to go.
So your advice is to get involved in leadership in academia. Huh?
I think that will help. I think the more of us who join the effort, and the more of us who stick out our neck, and the more of us that show guts and courage, fortitude intestinal or something lower, whatever you call that in Spanish, I think you know what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you.
John,
Is it correct? Fortitude intestinal?
Un problema intestinal sería un...
No, fortitude, to be strong.
Claro.
Don't you have the word? En français, on dit la fortitude intestinale. Où is Edgar Caussel? Is he there? Because he speaks French. Comment est-ce qu'on dit la fortitude intestinale en espagnol?
Hacer de tripas corazón, algo así podría ser.
Oh, have a strong heart.
Yeah, that's right. Oh,
but I'm talking about guts. Having strong guts.
Hacer tripas corazón.
Tripas. Yes, exactly. Having tripas. Avoir des tripes is the stomach.
Sí.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question for you, John, if I may.
Yes, who is speaking?
Gonzalo.
Okay,
here.
Gonzalo. Okay, yeah.
So for many of us are teaching leadership-related things at the graduate and undergraduate levels. And if you take seriously what you have talked today, one of the consequences is that the things that you teach should change dramatically. And for instance, I imagine that your syllabus would spend most of the time debunking myths about leadership theories, and very little time talking about things that we actually know about leadership. So how would you do that? I mean, how does your syllabus, how do you teach this?
There are few good studies on the topic, not only in industrial psychology, but also from social psychology, also from political science, also from economics. So I think overall, if you look carefully enough into all areas of leadership, you will find enough good studies to build a proper syllabus and show a few good research studies about what we know on a particular topic. So personally, I would not teach anything that I know for a fact is full of endogeneity. I'll say, I'm sorry. I'll say, this is what some people say, or this is what they think, but we don't know really what's going on here. So, if I talk about charisma, I will not teach anything or any research that is not based on a proper experimental manipulation of charisma, or something where we can ensure charisma is exogenous and not just using people's opinions, unless we use instrumental variables to correct for that. So I know it's tough what I'm saying, and especially it's a bigger problem, I think, in OB, because I think leadership in general, the quality of research in leadership, I think in general is slightly better than in OB in general, because OB is very diverse. We have some areas that are really good and some that are not so good. Strategy is doing very well, because in strategy, I think one of the reasons why they're a bit more advanced than management in general is because a lot of people who have straddled economics and management go in there. So, I have to be honest with myself when I say that, and I'm not an economist, by the way. I think all of you know that I'm not. I'm a psychologist, but at least economists know how to do it right when it comes to non-experimental research. We still have a lot to catch up. And in the HLM paper that I published, we showed that papers from strategy were more likely to use the correct estimator, the correct econometric estimator for panel data. So anyhow, I guess I gave you a very long answer and I talked about other things, but I think there's enough literature that you can give at least a balanced view to say, look, this is what we think, this is what people say, but wait, there are problems with this. Look what happens when we study it more consequentially.
Great. There's a question by Eduardo on the chat.
Yeah, I see. Okay. John, could you go back to your main recommendations when you have an X that is difficult to manipulate? In other words, when it is very hard to run an experiment or a quasi-experiment, what does one's research need to have in for your journal to consider it high quality? I know you talked about it, just need to hear it again. Okay, let's just go back. And I'll give you a very tangible example. Actually, you know what? I'm going to change slides. I just gave a workshop Hold on, I need to just quickly, well, I'll describe it. Just wait, I'll go back here.
We have a few minutes, so you can go ahead and get it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's actually okay. I can use the current slides. I'll just explain a bit more. So this is, I was going to pull some slides from the paper I'm working on testing mediation. Okay, let me go through this very carefully. Imagine you're interested to examine why, and that's worker performance, and you believe that how charismatic the leader is in terms of how they speak affects worker performance. So you believe that M affects Y. Okay. Now, I'm going to randomize managers to X being 0, where I give them some kind of bogus or placebo training, and to 1, where I teach them charisma. Which means that in the two groups, I'm going to have an equal amount of clever people and dumb people spread across the two groups, an equal amount of people who are naturally charismatic, an equal amount of people who are extroverted, an equal amount of age, whatever. There's going to be balance on any covariates that could possibly predict M and could possibly predict Y. But this exogenous manipulation only ensures that we have balance for X. It does not ensure we have balance for M with respect to Y. Let me explain. M can move because I taught you to be more charismatic. But M can also move because you are smarter, because you are more open, because you're more extroverted, because of your experiences. So let's call that Q. So if Q makes you more charismatic, Q can also make your workers work harder because you show them better solutions to problems, or because they like you more, or because for whatever reason. Okay. So you see, these omitted variables are not randomized with respect to M. They're only randomized with respect to X. So this is the huge problem. So when you have a design like this, so imagine M is LMX. Of course, I can estimate then the effect of LMX on Y by doing this. I can manipulate managers to act in a certain way. I can measure LMX, and then I can measure Y. But if you have this kind of design, X is a perfect instrument because it's been randomized, which means you can then use an instrumental variable estimator to estimate the model. Okay. If you use full mediation or partial mediation, it's not going to work. Only IV is going to work. So did I answer the question, or how about you give me a follow-up question? Eduardo, so what was not so clear before and what is clear now?
It's perfect now.
Okay, so do you see how easy it is? So that's what Gwendolyn Sajon shows in her paper, is M sometimes is not manipulatable directly, so we manipulate causes of M, and then we use an IV, instrumental variable estimator, to estimate the system of equations. We don't use Preacher and Hayes, we don't use Edwards and Lambert, we don't use Barron and Kenny. Those are wrong, wrong, wrong. And I hope in 20 years' time, I don't see any of that stuff being done. It can only be done if M is exogenous, and that's going to be very unusual. Because if M depends on something, how can it be exogenous? By definition, it cannot be exogenous. And you know what? Some of you probably have tried to send your work to journals like this, and they throw it back to you. Use Preacher and Hayes, bootstrap. You know, sometimes your job is also to educate the reviewers. I have had to do it my whole life. You know what a difficulty I've had to publish papers? For me, it's been extremely hard. In 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5, it was hard, very, very hard. But now I think the way has been opened, and you guys should have the guts and the tripes to do this. How's that?
Very good, thanks.
Any other questions do we have?
I just want to say, Jan, fantastic presentation, very inspirational. A lot of good insights. I think we need to introduce that practices in our research. I believe even when sometimes when I read your tweets in Twitter, I feel you are an annoying person. Sometimes I feel that, but I think you are right? Is the right annoying person, is the right Taliban in our field. I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to get connected with you, with people like you, inspiring, providing some way of doing better research. The only thing I believe we need more, I don't know if you are the person to do that, but as Maximiliano asked you, we need more resources, because we understand maybe the rationale of making claims about causality, about endogeneity, or all these problems, but we need more practical resources. For example, a website where there is different kind of applied or a specific tutorial or specific tools to deal with that. Maybe a student of yours or something involved in more practice would be beneficial, because I think today people is understanding the problem. However, the feeling is difficult, or we don't know how to deal with it in practice with our models. So that would be my suggestion. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for the time you devote to us and to get connected with a small society in South America. And when this situation is finished of pandemia, of course, we are going to invite you again to Chile to have a very fancy ceviche.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you, Hector. And yes, it's true. I can realize why I'm annoying. Socrates was also very annoying, and he said that Athens, the city of Athens, needs to have a gadfly. A gadfly is those big horse flies that bite the horse, and it bothers the horse, and the horse moves, and it comes back, and it bites you, and it bites you, and it just will not stop. And I know I am like a gadfly, and I will not stop until I die. But I hope that one of you does not make me drink the poison like Socrates had to drink. They made him drink hemlock because he denounced the gods that everyone was praying to, and he made people think. So, you know, we need more gadflies. And I think all you guys are also very, very smart, and you can also play your role. You know, I can be the big gadfly, but you can be some smaller ones that also are annoying. Even a mosquito, that's also very annoying.
Thank you, Jan.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone wants to, any resources or, I mean, anything that I cited that you can't find, just email me. I'm happy to respond to you, okay? Just tell me, remind me who you are, because I get a lot of emails all the time, and you know, sometimes I just can't respond, but you know, for people that I know, I try my best to respond.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank
So
you
we'll
very
have
much.
our